the video sort of reminds me of one of my favorite jokes about husbands and wives and the whole head of the household thing. And it goes like this. Do you want to talk to the man in charge or the woman who knows what's happening? When it comes to your life, do you want to talk to the people who are trying to run the world or the God who knows what's happening? What have you been feeding lately? Your faith or your fear? Have you been seeking the one who knows everything or chasing after the ones who know nothing? Have you gotten that impression in the last couple of years, particularly with this pandemic? We hear, follow the science an awful lot, but the science changes constantly. The advice we're given today is nothing like what we were told a year ago, sometimes even a month or a week ago. How long did it take you to get the impression that none of these people have any certainty about what they're doing? We don't know what's going to happen next, and neither do they. It's the blind leading the blind. As the writer of Ecclesiastes would have put it, you might remember this from when we studied Ecclesiastes, there is nobody under the sun who has any idea about what's going to happen next. And not just with COVID either. Will there be another global plague? How will the next world war start? Will the Detroit Lions ever make it to a Super Bowl? Nobody under the sun has the answers to any of these questions. But you and I are very well acquainted with someone who isn't under the sun. With someone who knows exactly what's going to happen and when, and isn't surprised by anything. That's how he could prophesy about the destruction of the Assyrians in 660 BC. Your enemy is coming to crush you, Nineveh. Man the ramparts, watch the roads, prepare your defenses, call out your forces. Soon the city is plundered, empty, and ruined. Hearts melt, knees shake. The people stand aghast, their faces pale and trembling. This was Nahum's message about Nineveh. Given, interestingly enough, at the pinnacle of the Assyrian Empire's power and glory. For hundreds of years, they had been perfecting their warcraft and expanding their empire. Some 60 years before Nahum's own prophecy, Assyria had crushed the northern kingdom of Israel and scattered them. And just 10 to 15 years before Nahum gave this prophecy, Assyria had conquered Egypt. They were the sole superpower of the entire world. There was nobody anywhere who could mount any serious opposition to them. Yet here was this little Jewish prophet declaring to the remaining Israelites of Judah that their mortal enemies were going to be destroyed. Who would believe such a crazy story? Nobody would have believed it could be possible that Assyria would fall. But God wasn't just telling crazy stories. He was telling crazy, detailed stories. God didn't just foretell Nineveh's demise. He revealed exactly how it was going to happen. In chapter 1, verses 7 and 8, it says, "The Lord is good, a strong refuge when trouble comes. He is close to those who trust in him. But he will sweep away his enemies in an overwhelming flood. He will pursue his foes into the realm of darkness." Just a few verses later, the prediction is even more explicit. The king shouts to his officers. They stumble in their haste, rushing to the walls to set up their defenses. The river gates have been torn open. The palace is about to collapse. To his audience, Nahum must have sounded like a total loon. The Assyrians were unstoppable, untouchable. To say that Nineveh was going to be destroyed would be like saying that Elon Musk is going to file for bankruptcy next year. Or that the Canadians will conquer and take over America. What Nahum was prophesying was impossible. But the historical record confirms what happened just 40 years after Nahum's prophecy. The Babylonians and Medo-Persians, who were trying to assert themselves on the world stage, began to siege Nineveh. And when they did that, they found out what everyone else already knew. Nineveh was an impregnable fortress. There was no conquering it. For 2 years, the attackers sieged the city in vain. You see, Nineveh was surrounded by walls 100 feet high and broad enough at the top to hold 4 chariots driven abreast. There was no getting through or over those walls. But the city was also built at the junction of the Tigris and Kosor rivers. And in 612 BC, the Kosor River flooded to such an extent that the force of the waters washed away a considerable section of the wall. And through this opening, the besiegers finally gained entrance and eventually burned the city to the ground. The river gates are torn open. God's enemies are swept away in an overwhelming flood. The palace collapses. What had seemed impossible even just a few days before it happened suddenly came to pass. And it was exactly as God had foretold 40 years before. It didn't matter that it sounded crazy. Our God is not crazy. You'd think there would have been some people who were familiar enough with Israel's history by that time that they would have caught on to the fact that even when what God says sounds crazy, you just might want to listen. Didn't God tell Noah to build a giant boat in the middle of the desert when there had never before been a drop of rain fall from the sky? Didn't God tell Moses that if he stretched out his hand, the Red Sea would split in two and the Israelites would walk through on dry land? Didn't God tell Joshua that if he led the people of Israel in a march around the city of Jericho 7 times for 7 days, that the walls would just fall down? When God says something that sounds crazy, we better listen. Because something crazy is probably about to happen. God is not surprised by anything. He wasn't surprised by anything that happened in the Old Testament. He wasn't surprised by anything that happened in the New Testament. And he's still not surprised by anything that happens today. All the things that catch us off guard are things he saw coming long before they ever got to us. You and me, we're just along for the ride. I love that I am preaching about God and surprises on this weekend, which is a very special weekend in the history of my family. Some of you might have seen a post on Facebook I made yesterday. Because 50 years ago, yesterday, January 29, my mom met my dad for the first time. And it was a big surprise. My dad was a 27-year-old Bible teacher who had brought a group of his high school students to a church near where my mom lived, a couple of states away. She was a 22-year-old physical therapist and had been invited by her pastor, who was a mutual friend of my dad's, to this church, where my dad was going to be preaching. So my mom went to the church that day, but sort of with an attitude. Because she was angry at God that she was going to have to spend the day with someone who was sure to be a loser. Otherwise, why would he be 27 and not get married? Well, they didn't have a chance to meet before the church service began. And I don't know how long it was into the church service when, as she was watching my dad preach and sing and be amazing, suddenly she was feeling like the loser. And now she was really mad at God. And that's why when my dad made a beeline for her after the service and smiled and said, "Hi, I'm Ken Wilson, and anybody that gives that much attention to a speaker, I have to know why." She was ready to disappear through a crack in the floor. Surprise. My dad was certainly not a loser. He was a most eligible bachelor who had a habit of dating nearly everyone and not really getting serious with anyone. What he needed was someone just like my mom, who, despite how she was feeling that day, was also not a loser. She just didn't know there was a man like my dad on the planet. And once she found out there was, she didn't think she'd have a chance with him, so she never threw herself at him like all the other girls. She had always thought she'd marry a farmer. He had always thought he'd never get married at all. Surprise. It was actually my grandfather who turned out to be the prophet in this particular situation. He had gone to church that day with my mom, and though she didn't find out about this until years later, when he returned home that day, he went into the house and said to my grandma, "Well, I met our son-in-law today." After she had gotten over her initial shock and heard a little bit about this Ken Wilson, she said, "And what makes you think he's going to be our son-in-law?" "Well," Grandpa said, "if you'd seen the way he looked at Joyce, and the way Joyce looked at him, you'd know he's going to be our son-in-law." Surprise. But not a surprise to God, who I'm sure was sitting in heaven that day having a good laugh about the whole situation. You see, he is not caught off guard by anything that comes to us in life, whether it's good or bad. He knows all the fun and cheerful stuff before it happens, and that means he also knows all the difficult and painful stuff before it happens. Just like he knew Jericho was going to fall, and Nineveh was going to fall, and Jerusalem was going to fall. Nothing catches him by surprise, and he's usually warning us about what he knows is coming. But even when he doesn't, I find it reassuring to know that whatever I'm dealing with today, God saw it all before it arrived at my doorstep. The famous Holocaust survivor Corrie ten Boom once said, "There is no panic in heaven. God has no problems, only plans." I don't know about you, but that gives me great comfort. To know that God is never surprised. He always knows what's coming. And because he has already seen what's on the way and has a plan to handle it, we, hopefully, can relax and trust him. We may get surprised by life sometimes, but whenever we do, let us hold tight to the assurance that our God has everything well in hand. He has no problems, only plans. And since there is never any panic in heaven, there doesn't ever have to be any panic in our hearts either.